Well, good morning. I think we're going to get started now. My name's Gary Rhodes. I'm a professor of higher education at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona and a member of the steering committee of United Campus Workers Arizona, Local 7065 of CWA. And I'm really excited to welcome you to this panel, Challenges of the Past and Perspectives on the Future of Academic Labor. We got a great group here of folks from progressive locals and a variety of national unions and affiliates. I'll introduce them just very briefly. The panel is going to discuss the challenges and possibilities of the academic labor movement as we organize and negotiate to advance interconnected workplace and social justice issues. We're going to try and provide a look into the ways that better serve and expand genuine educational opportunity, success, and quality of life for the populations, communities, states, tribal nations. We're all wherever we are on indigenous lands at this moment, country and world in which we are connected and to which we are responsible. Each of the panelists is going to talk a little bit about the antecedents leading up to this COVID moment, the impact of COVID, and then also we'll spend some time talking not just about where we are now, but moving ahead to discuss their perspective on future short-term and long-term future possibilities. We're going to each take about 10 minutes, which should leave us 30 to 35 minutes at the end for questions and conversation. And I'll just briefly say about the folks, the order that we're going to go in is a little different than what's on the program. We thought we'd go a little bit from local to national and from East Coast to West Coast. So we're going to have Becky Given of the AAUP, AFT, Rutgers. Really interesting and progressive combination of unions of locals representing a whole variety of academic employees. Then we're going to move to Charles Toombs, who's president of the California Faculty Association, statewide, massive system, obviously, and so often central in progressive discussions nationally of academic labor. Then we're going to move to Jamie Martin of APSCUF, president of APSCUF, which also is a very distinctive and interesting and independent progressive union in Pennsylvania. And then finally, we'll close out with Justin Dezanos, who is the NEA organizational specialist and higher education team member for NEA. And then I'll have some closing remarks as well. So I think with that, Becky, we'll go to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Thanks to Bill and Gary and all the organizers. And it's great to be here today. I'll keep this brief because I think a lot of the value is in the discussion and the interaction that we'll have. So let me say a few things. I'm the vice president of the full-time AUP AFT chapter at Rutgers, which is a mouthful, but let me say what that means. We are a jointly affiliated chapter. So we are affiliated both with AUP and AFT. And we are about 50 years old, and we represent full-time faculty and graduate workers, as well as postdocs and some counselors. So we're very unusual in that we are representing both faculty and grad workers. And in fact, we're in the same bargaining unit. So we bargain a single contract that covers faculty and graduate workers. We represent Rutgers workers statewide, so 3 main campuses, New Brunswick, Newark, and Camden. New Brunswick is the largest and best resource, so that our starting point has a lot of complexity and challenges around unequal allocation of resources and inequities across the state. We work at Rutgers. There are 30,000 employees at Rutgers, of which 20,000 are represented by unions in roughly 24 bargaining units, everything from Committee of Interns and Residents representing medical residents to we have multiple different AFT units. Some are healthcare worker units on the medical side. We have CWA, AFSCME, Teamsters, many unions, and several of the unions have multiple different bargaining units. So we are a diverse set of workers. The majority of Rutgers workers are unionized. Prior to the pandemic, the kinds of issues we'd faced are the kinds that you are all familiar with. We had, been on the ups and downs of the economic cycle. During previous economic hard times, there had been a lot of fights around a pay freeze. We have had, under the Chris Christie administration, our healthcare costs went up massively. And we had worked, the unions, the different bargaining units had worked, I would say we were cordial, but hadn't worked tightly together. So we had, for instance, fought to line up the expiration dates of most of our contracts, and that was a really good thing. But we hadn't had the close joint work that we have, that I'll describe a little bit about, that we've ended up doing since the pandemic. When the pandemic first hit, like many of you, our first concern was health and safety. So we had a number of immediate health and safety issues. Obviously, the move to remote was very challenging for instructors and also for research folks who had massive disruption, and people who had, various kinds of things in their labs that they had to take care of. They couldn't actually just be gone, and all kinds of safety challenges. But for us, it really crystallized around the libraries. There was an initial reluctance to shut down the libraries for in-person services and in-person work. And I think many of you probably faced this. The university was making initial decisions on a number of grounds. Ultimately, they were pretty good on safety, but initially they wanted to make sure that they presented this view that the university was open. I think they really didn't want students asking for tuition reimbursements and things like that. So they wanted to present this sense that the libraries were open for in-person services. And that meant essentially forcing library workers, faculty, and staff to be there in person. We had a tremendous fight around that. Ultimately, we had to go to the state. One of the things I think is really important when you're bargaining, sometimes it's at the bargaining table with your employer, sometimes it's with your community, sometimes it's with legislative folks. We had to go to the state and get an executive order. And if you read the executive order shutting down the libraries, it explicitly states that college and university libraries are included, not just libraries generally, but specifies and includes computer labs, because there was this claim that the libraries couldn't shut down because the computer labs were needed. So we had that big fight, and that really brought us together, the different unions, because folks in different bargaining units work in the libraries. We then, as things unfolded, moved to, I guess, the financial crisis phase of the pandemic, which all of you have faced. There were massive immediate layoffs, which was very frustrating for us. And this is where the solidarity was really important. The layoffs were never in our bargaining unit, right? We mostly represent faculty and grad workers who are on, multi-year, if not tenured or tenure eligible contracts. And so we don't have layoffs as a significant threat, but there were layoffs to folks like dining hall workers, people whose work is primarily in the dorms. And it was extremely frustrating, because while the university said, there's no work for these people, there was also no work for folks in canceled sports, but they were not laid off. We also had this quite stark contrast with the state of New Jersey, who also had many workers whose workplace were closed, and they dealt with everything through furloughs, whereas Rutgers did layoffs, which meant people lost their health insurance during a terrifying pandemic. Their children, many people work at Rutgers to get the tuition remission for their children. The children were facing not completing their degrees. And so we sprung to action and talked about a progressive response to the pandemic, protecting the most vulnerable. We really highlighted some of the cruelty of the layoffs, and we came together. And the coalition, as you can imagine, it's messy, it's very, very hard work, but we started meeting frequently, talking frequently, meeting with our members jointly, not separately, really working together. And I'll fast forward a bit, but the sort of where we are now is, as we expected, the university invoked this clause in several, including our bargaining agreement, and in several others, where they could invoke they could declare a fiscal emergency and therefore withhold our raises. And if they did that, because of a decent contract language, we had the ability to grieve that and ultimately have an arbitrator rule on whether indeed there was a fiscal emergency. So we were proceeding down that road. We had had our raises withheld, and the university claimed that they would show it was a fiscal emergency truly, and that they would cancel those raises permanently. Now, we, of course, would like to have our raises back, but our priorities were much, much bigger than that. So when I talk about bargaining, and I'm a labor studies professor, so I also teach collective bargaining, what I always say is, it's fun to talk about this with lawyers, I say there's no scope of bargaining. So if you've been at a bargaining table, your lawyers will say, this is in the scope of bargaining, this isn't. You know, you can bargain over pay increases, but you can't bargain over, let's say, class size. And when I say there's no scope of bargaining, what I'm saying is if you build enough power and you think through your relationships strategically, you can bargain over anything. And so we, ostensibly, this arbitration case was just whether there was really a fiscal emergency and whether the raises would be withheld or not. But we took the opportunity to settle that arbitration case, and say we want to massively expand the issues we're working on, and we want to do that as a coalition. So we set forth our priorities, which were an end to layoffs, extensions for our graduate students, including our graduate workers, because as you guys, any of you who are working with grads know, their progress towards degree was massively disrupted, and without extended funding, they're in real and financial danger. And eventually a deferral of our raises rather than a cancellation. So we said we'll delay them, but we won't accept them being canceled. And what we had to offer was, as well as this this pay increase deferral, we offered them a work share program, which we started offering last May. And I won't get into the weeds of it now, although if folks want to hear about it, I can either share some written stuff or talk about it more in the Q&A. But basically, we realized that thanks to federal legislation and some supportive legislation in New Jersey, we could implement a work sharing program, which is also called short time compensation, where basically workers would furlough for part of their week. And the wages that you lose from your employer, from Rutgers, would be made up for, or as it turns out, more than made up for, with money from the unemployment insurance program in the state. We could save, initially when we offered it in about May 2020, we could have saved the university between 100 and 150 million. They didn't go for it then. They couldn't quite get their act together. They ended up taking our idea. They did like the idea of savings. They first imposed it on the non-union represented employees. And eventually when we negotiated the settlement, these major bargaining units have also negotiated it. And it's complicated. It means that our members, tenured distinguished professors making deep into the six figures are signing on for New Jersey unemployment insurance benefits and emailing us about, why do I have to make a PIN for the New Jersey Department of Labor system? There's a lot of complexity to it, but ultimately it is a form of shared sacrifice from especially the full-time faculty, for our shared interest in protecting the most vulnerable. One other piece I didn't mention, and then I'll wrap up, our part-time lecturers, our adjunct faculty, we call them part-time lecturers. They're in a sibling AAUP AFT chapter, and they were facing a massive crisis. They were caught up in a university-wide hiring freeze, which meant that they were at risk of non-renewal. The academic units were told to cut 20% of adjunct hiring. And so they were really in a significantly difficult situation. They don't have pay increases to be canceled and don't have ongoing contracts in the way that the full-time faculty do. So again, expanding the scope of bargaining, we said we're going to negotiate and make sure that hiring freeze is removed. And we didn't get a commitment to go back to, let's say 2019 adjunct faculty levels, but what we did get is a commitment that adjunct hiring would return to the programs and they would hire based on programmatic needs, not just some blanket refusal. And again, they weren't a party to these negotiations. They're not in that part of the they don't have the fiscal emergency language. And we said, you know what, we're negotiating for that too. So overall, the work of the coalition is complicated and messy, but we brought people to the table who were not sort of technically at the table, and we won a lot for the most vulnerable. So I think I've probably been talking long enough. I'll stop for now, and I'll just say for the future, we have an unbelievably strong coalition now. We have built relationships, we have built trust, we have aligned contracts, and we're ready to move forward.
That's great, Becky. Great laying out of the sort of disaster academic capitalism claims of management, and then the tremendous coalitional work focused on social justice, racial justice, workplace justice issues. Thank you. Charles, you want to talk about California?
Yes, thanks, Gary, and hello to everyone. When I think about the past year, two items immediately come to mind. One, of course, is the pandemic, and the other is the racial reckoning. Prior to the pandemic, CFA had issued an equity interrupted white paper in which we argued that the funding, we don't really need to argue, we just showed that public funding for the CSU went down as the majority of students became students of color. And so our advocacy, that paper went a long way in the state capitol, and we are slowly beginning to get the funding that we need to operate the CSU at the level that it needs. But I want to move on into the last year. So some of the things that Rebecca mentioned at the start of the pandemic, we had to address as well. The move of faculty to virtual learning, what that would mean on each campus. And let me do say this, just in case folks do not know about the California State University system. We have 23 campuses. The California Faculty Association represents over 29,000 faculty, and that includes instructional faculty, contingent faculty, tenure line, counselor faculty, librarian faculty, and coaching faculty. At any rate, once the pandemic started, we had to address a lot of things immediately, but we also wanted to look at the long-term plan for the CSU and what CFA would do to ensure faculty rights. So in June of 2020, we issued a document, the CFA Way Forward, a long-term plan to defend quality higher education. And I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of that document now. We first of all insisted that there should be no privatization or profiting off of public higher education during this pandemic crisis. And in the summer of 2020, we did not know what was going to happen in the fall of 2020. So we needed to immediately address what a return to campus might look like if we were going to be going back. And that plan continues to inform our work as we think about repopulation for fall of 2021. But as Rebecca mentioned, health and safety were paramount, sanitation, essential, all the physical distancing guidelines, safety for faculty, staff, students, etc. We also wanted to defend academic freedom and to protect intellectual property, particularly during the virtual instruction where administrators would have access to a lot of material and may want to use it. We also wanted to make sure that healthcare coverage continued, particularly for our contingent faculty if their entitlement went below 0.4, and and they would therefore lose health benefits. We wanted to fight for faculty jobs. So those are some of the highlights, but I want to get into some real specifics now because they are actually supporting all of the work that we're doing now as we move forward. So health and safety requirements are essential. We know now, just about a few weeks ago, I don't remember the exact date, the chancellor of our system and the UC system announced that there would be required vaccinations for fall. We just had the announcement. We do not have the policy yet, but CFA will be meeting and conferring on particularly the implementation of that policy. Our faculty have lots of concerns about it. The majority of them are in favor of vaccinations in the sense it will make them feel safer. We also need to continue to work on workload and job accommodations. We think that there has to be the option for virtual instruction for many of our faculty who, for whatever reasons, are not able to be vaccinated. We know that during the pandemic and virtual learning, there will be this push by the administration to increase cap loads in our courses. And we know that the pandemic has absolutely shown that students need a lot of attention in virtual instruction, and large class sizes do not help. We also want to ensure that we provide accommodations for parents and caregivers. We know the increased burden that the pandemic has had on our parents. Many of them are women of color and parents of color. Librarian, coaching, and counselors' rights need to be respected. Particularly, the pandemic has shown that librarians do not need to be confined to the library space to do their work. And so we want virtual options for our coaches and librarians. Evaluation and retaliation and job security are important. There should be no retaliation for faculty who, for whatever reason, cannot do face-to-face instruction. We want student surveys restructured to account for the special burden that this might be on, that it might have on the evaluation of faculty. We also know that student evaluations in general are biased against our faculty of color. In addition to those, as we move forward, so this plan is not just about the pandemic, it's about how do we continue to defend quality higher education in the CSU system. We want to recognize and reward BIPOC faculty for their scholarship and creative work, and that work is evaluated appropriately in the tenure and promotion process. We know that because of the racial reckoning, we have to confront white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. So our plan will endorse and address CFA's demands around anti-Black racism. We have a long list of those demands. There should be no militarization of police or racial profiling of our faculty and students. We also want the racial pay equity gap addressed. Resource centers and ethnic studies departments and programs must be supported and extended on all of our campuses. We want to address the severe underrepresentation of BIPOC faculty throughout the CSU, especially African American faculty and Native and Indigenous faculty. We want to contest the model minority myth of APITA exceptionalism. We want to fund a variety of programs that will address these racial narratives and myths on our campus. We want to mandate anti-racism education for all personnel holding administrative positions throughout the CSU. We want more personnel hired who actually look like our students in these administrative positions. We are demanding tuition-free education for targeted groups, particularly African American and Native and Indigenous students. Let's see, as I go on here. Again, we want to protect faculty rights. We want to do work to make contingent faculty positions more permanent, that they have access to to tenure track positions. Want to protect LGBTQIA students, faculty, and staff. And we want all of our campuses to be involved in specific and explicit anti-racism transformation. In addition, we want folks to get involved with the new Deal campaign for higher education to address some of these issues at the national level. We think you all should be involved in working on ways to make contingent faculty work permanent and respected. And we still have to address the need for adequate public funding as we move forward in our mission. And I think as I begin to wrap up, I just want to say that we have to move beyond the buzz phrases and actually do the work and demand that we transform our campuses. So I'll stop there, and I think I've done about 10 minutes.
Oh, that's great, Charles. And as with Becky, a really nice example of how so many creative ideas and a progressive vision of the future come from the ranks of campus workers and are built on an understanding of these ongoing systemic inequities that define the systems before the pandemic, but have been amplified and even more surfaced during it. Jamie, we'll shift to you, talk a bit about Pennsylvania and your situation there and what you've been doing in the union.
Oh, thank you, Gary, and to the other panelists. It's been a pleasure working with you as we're getting ready for this and to hear all of what you have to say here today. I'm the president of APSCUF. It's an unusual acronym. It's the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties. We represent the faculty and coaches, including our adjunct faculty members at 14 publicly funded, poorly publicly funded universities across the Commonwealth. And so I guess I'll start with where we've come. I'm nearing the end of my first year in this position. I started on June 1st of 2020. And what I can say clearly is that it's been the worst of times and the worst of times. Much like Charles and Becky discussed, when I started in June, the very first issue that we were facing was the possibility of returning to face-to-face classes in the fall semester. Unlike some of the other, maybe what Charles and Becky were talking about, the decision about the format of classes, the extent to which students would come back to our campuses or not come back to our campuses was not a universal or statewide decision. The chancellor of the state system permitted the university presidents at all 14 of our universities and their leadership teams to decide what they should do. And so as a result, we had basically 14 different decisions across the Commonwealth, where in some cases, at some universities, the presidents decided pretty quickly that they were going to go fully remote. You could hear a sigh of relief from our faculty members on those campuses. At other campuses, there were decisions made to bring back, in some cases, fairly significant numbers of students. And not surprisingly, we began to see COVID cases, the case counts increase on those campuses. We saw the COVID dashboards introduced. And so it really was a mixed bag. We did do a faculty survey leading up to that fall semester and had overwhelming response rates with faculty identifying all of the kinds of concerns I'm sure all of you actually had to deal with health and safety issues and concerns about students actually doing the kinds of things they should do to remain safe and keep other people safe. As you might know, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is very rural. We have a few universities that are in or closer to urban centers, but for the most part, most of our universities are scattered about the Commonwealth and in very rural areas. And the reason I mentioned that, access to broadband is very limited, and for sometimes access to any kind of internet connectivity is pretty spotty. So this really impacted our students' ability to take the hybrid or fully online courses, and clearly had an impact on faculty members who were concerned about the educational experiences of their students. And so they had to really work on those kinds of issues and concerns. But it seemed like we were able to work through many of those kinds of issues, concerns, and getting back to campus when suddenly trains number 1 and 2 began hurtling down 2 different tracks, focusing on our faculty and staff members at our universities. The first was a requirement for all 14 universities to reach financial sustainability, and there were metrics given that had to be met. Initially, every university had 5 years, and that was accelerated to 3. And so all of a sudden, for some of our campuses, it led to a lot of panic, I think, but it also led to 113 letters of retrenchment being issued at 5 of our universities in October. So we've been working diligently to try to find alternatives to retrenchment, to try to figure out what other kinds of things could we do. We've had some success. There are a lot of grievances filed. We have had dozens and dozens and dozens of meet and discuss meetings. We have managed to have some letters rescinded. We've found positions for some of our faculty members at other universities where there were openings. But as of today, we still have 34 of our colleagues who will be out of a job in a few weeks at 5 universities. But the impact of those retrenchment letters that were issued have reached far beyond the individuals. The retrenchment has targeted the fine arts, foreign languages, anthropology departments. At some campuses, it led to the elimination of entire departments such as journalism or decision sciences, and the total elimination of library services at Cheyney University, which is one of the oldest HBCUs in the country. And how you could have a university without having library services is truly beyond us. So that was the one train. The second train is the consolidation. And so there currently is a plan underway to consolidate 6 of our universities into 2. This process began in October of 2020, the same time the letters of retrenchment came out. It's moved extremely quickly. The state system just presented a 439-page consolidation plan in late April. We still have a lot of questions, and they were not answered in that 439-page document. And the process is currently moving forward with an open public comment period with final consideration for implementation, or moving to the implementation phase scheduled for July. And so in a 9-month period of time, we're looking at the consolidation of 6 universities, each over 150 years old, being consolidated into 2. I guess if I had to think about what the crux of the issue is, all of you have mentioned it, the lack of funding. Pennsylvania ranks 48th in the nation in funding for public higher education. And we have we rank near the top for student debt load from student loans. But as I'm thinking about the future, maybe some bright lights have come of this. I think Becky mentioned the coalitions that they're working with at the Rutgers campuses. We've really worked collaboratively with our sister unions and other unions that represent other individuals on our campuses. I think in terms of our own faculty and our coaches, facing the hardships that we have this past year really has led to solidarity across the 14. There's this notion of we're all in this together. So even though we've seen retrenchment only impact 5 universities, the faculty at the other universities are very concerned and have provided a lot of support. And even though there are only 6 universities facing consolidation at this point, clearly there are faculty at other campuses that are saying we could be next, and what can we do to help? So there's been increases in sharing of information, and it no longer feels like we're all on our own island thinking about our own issues, but rather what are our colleagues across these campuses, both faculty, staff, and our students, what are they facing and how can we help? So I guess I'll stop there, but those are the kinds of things that we've been dealing with here in Pennsylvania.
Jamie, I think that is such a excellent encapsulation of an awful situation that's a function of not just systematic disinvestment. I know in Pennsylvania, you're something like 47th, 48th in funding per capita for students, but it's also mismanagerially made disasters over the course of a decade in terms of investing in facilities and kind of an amenities arms race. You got this big debt load on the institutions. And I think your closing there is a wonderful example of, we've heard a lot as faculty over the past year about we're all in this together, even as people are being laid off and they're disproportionately lower wage workers, people of color, adjunct faculty. But to hear that the faculty and other workers are truly coming together and seeing that we are all in this together and able to come up with some alternatives is inspiring in all kinds of creative coalitions. So now we'll shift to Justin at a national level at the NEA.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's doing okay. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for sharing a lot of really great deep knowledge happening at the local level. So I'm going to give some broad strokes and hopefully touch on some things that haven't been touched on or to reinforce some things that have been. But I'm sure I'm going to miss a lot. It's a big picture. So again, my name is Justin. I'm an organizational specialist. So that means I'm an organizer and I work with our state affiliates, NEA state affiliates in all over the country to develop organizing plans and fight back against a lot of what my fellow panelists have talked about today. So coming at it first, one thing I want to clear or make sure that everybody hears this about community colleges. And I know oftentimes when in some of our panels, everything we talk about higher ed equaling 4-year institutions, but with community colleges, we're facing a massive reckoning with declining and decreasing enrollment, often impacting, of course, program position cuts and implementation of austerity measures. And what's alarming, is that about this year from fall of 2019 or fall of 2020 on, we've had a nationwide 22.7% drop in freshman enrollment within community colleges. This is a major problem, of course. In addition to that, as some of my fellow panelists mentioned, we talk about declining funding. Declining funding is not a new problem, but of course, it was most acutely felt, especially before a lot of our CARES Act, the HEERF2 and all those packages came through. Funding is down and it continues to be down, and we're not going to be able to count on massive influx of at least COVID relief. So it draws us to have a coordinated effort to get some of those funds in a more routine year in, year out. Because without the federal funding, we're looking at from year to year, from last year to this year, a 1.3% drop in funding for public higher education. And so what does that do? One of the things that we're looking at the national level and experiencing or hearing from all sorts of our affiliates are talking about capital debt. One of the things we haven't mentioned on this panel, but I'd like to really point out is that capital debt, and that's for building of campus infrastructure to attract higher paying out-of-state students, is being funded but through issuing bonds that are underwritten by Wall Street. And so, one of the campaigns that I've been diligently working on is with Massachusetts Teachers Association. I want to point out, the UMass system there has laid off, hundreds and furloughed thousands of workers, hours, and then also in the unions that we're coordinating with in comprehensive campaigning up there. And they're doing so earlier or last year, citing about $165 million in projected revenue shortages. But some research done by Acre, and I'll put the in the chat here, really shows that the UMass system alone in 2019 paid $116 million in interest and fees. So this is year in, year out. And as we look at, how do we need to address the shortage and revenue, because we obviously have a problem, we have to drive, of course, progressive revenue, but then also look at where is the regressive spending happening. Charles mentioned, we need to move away from, militarization of our police. That's one form of major regressive spending. But the other is, of course, breaking off huge chunks of our income, or not income, but our finances, our resources over to Wall Street banks. So there's got to be a solution to that. In Salem State University, members of NEA, MTA, had done some really amazing research. In that research, they were able to show that at their university, which has about 40% of their students are people of color, they found that FTE students had about $3,000 of their tuition go ostensibly to debt service, right? And that's a major problem. So that passes that buck on in the form of student debt, and people are paying on that year in and year out. And it's particularly and most acutely impacting people of color, first generation students. So when we got this declining enrollment, we've got a shortage in resources, declining funding, and then of course outlay and capital debt. That's all being run by an increasingly corporatized higher ed environment. We don't talk about it a ton, but it's an interesting thing to campaign on. But it's this blossoming and this blooming of the non-academic professional class, which seems to go on every year. It constantly outpaces full-time faculty, hiring contingent faculty. That non-academic professional class sucks up a lot of resource, and therefore makes our systems increasingly more complicated to understand, who decides where money is being spent, how are these people getting into their positions of power. I'll take and it goes right to the top at the University of Massachusetts system and their Board of Higher Education. We did some research on the composition of their boards, and their boards, it almost seems that any sort of higher education or education experience at all is no longer necessary, right? You can be on a board of one of the largest public higher education systems if you're a real estate investment banker, right? Or if you're a charter school executive or a former charter school executive. So this is the path that we're heading towards, which is increased corporatization, which therefore results in more complex systems that we have to bargain against, and we have to build coalition to push against. And then, of course, dive deeper into the research, more comprehensive style, not just what are the dollar figures, but who are the people making the decisions. So in this atmosphere, we're obviously seeing our students are suffering, especially our community college students. We've got increased levels of debt. Programs are being slashed and cut, and although some of them are coming back with the federal funding, but just in general, lack of resources. There's major issues with the digital divide, people being able to access their online classes. There are stories of folks in the Midwest or tribal colleges who are driving hours to sit in a parking lot to gain access to Wi-Fi. This is a major problem, and also gives us an opportunity to coordinate with folks on shared issues and problems, which is something that we need to do. And then in general, when it comes to not just what is labor in higher education, what are we facing in terms of funding? Of course, as all my fellow panelists mentioned, this health and safety issue, and for our students, but it's also just national, state, or I'll just say state legislatures pushing anti-union legislation. You know, we look at Florida just recently. You know, we're talking about pushes to eliminate collective bargaining, limits the scope of bargaining. We're talking about assaults on academic freedom. You know, the intellectual diversity. You know, an issue by the conservative parts of our legislature in Florida. You know, voter suppression, limits on peaceful protests. All these issues directly impact us on campus, right? When we're going to have to organize, we're going to have to do all these things. So so that's just this national kind of, this is the bubble that we're living in right now. But I'll also say, like Jamie, I'm excited in some ways, right? Right now, you know, I'll say anecdotally, the NEA, which represents we have about 150,000 higher ed members. About 94% of them are in public institutions, about 6% in private institutions. But we're organizing like crazy right now. New units. You know, I personally am working with folks in a large community college in Pennsylvania. We've got folks in the Midwest and the Southwest. And so this is a major uptick in activity for new organizing. And that's exciting. That's one of the most incredible things that we could be doing as a group, is supporting that kind of work and bringing people into having a bigger voice so that we can attack the health and safety issues, or, you know, in the way that we need to, because the vast majority of folks still don't have a voice or democracy in the workplace. Two, we are diving deep into research capacity. You know, large systems especially are far more complex and corporatized than they were 20 to 30 years ago. The number of decision makers has, of course, expanded in some ways. And finances, building agreements, all this stuff, it's very, very complicated. And you know, diving deep into who decides, who appoints whom, who are the decision makers, all those things. You know, we're really focusing on and expanding that capacity. But I also say it's not just the NEA, but I know the AFT, AUP, they're doing some of that work too. And then of course, bargaining for the common good has also really jumped into that space to help folks get the basic tools and the wherewithal to properly research their institutions, both in times of collective bargaining, but other times as well. Other great things. We're back at the table with the feds. You know, just a couple months ago, the vast majority of unions who represent workers on campuses or institutions of higher education were brought in to have some early phase discussions with the Department of Education. You know, the Betsy DeVos era was a dark one, or, you know, sometimes I think of it as a dim one, right? But all in all, you know, things are looking a little bit up, but not only in like being able to go and work with the Department of Education, but then the kind of cross collaboration we're seeing with our other national unions who are working on and who represent workers and institutions of higher education. So not everything's official yet, but we are certainly at the national level more deeply partnering and becoming a lot more collaborative in terms of comprehensive campaigning and what the future looks like. With, you know, folks, you know, we're in discussions with folks at AFT and AUP. They've got a really great campaign, this New Deal for Higher Education, to reauthorize the Higher Ed Act and create kind of other federal policies to establish dedicated public funding, and then, but more importantly, hold administrations accountable for how they spend that money. So we're really excited to get into that stream, and the details are being still worked out, but obviously, like, very, very exciting news. And we're supporting unions like the Massachusetts Teachers Association, who have about 115,000 members, about 18,000 of which, if I got that number right, are higher ed workers. But in their bargaining for the common good campaigns, right? You may have heard that term tossed around a lot over the years. It's great work. I definitely encourage everybody to take a look at, you know, bargainingforthecommongood.org. But really kind of entrenching ourselves with issues. I believe it was Rebecca who said, and who just shared in the chat, bargaining for the common good. But, you know, there is no scope of bargaining, and I similarly believe the same thing, right? If we have enough power, if we have enough collaboration with people who share our issues, we can have a major impact at every level, not just at the bargaining table, but in state houses, legislatures, also, you know, at the national, federal level. And then, you've got some good stuff happening with, obviously the relief funding. Without that relief funding, obviously we'd be looking at another sharp decline in funding for higher education, but that's good news. Biden has, reversed a lot of the Trump exec orders on like DACA and immigration visas for the international students and faculty. Also really great news. So, I mean, I'm going on a lot. Hopefully I'm hitting a number of things that people are really interested in. But what I'm really excited about is increased level of organizing, an increased level of and the desire to collaborate with national unions who represent a variety of different kinds of workers and institutions of higher education. The future, the opportunity is now, and it's in front of us. And I think coming out of a pretty dark period, we might see some success and in our future.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And I like the dim reference. I also appreciate you raising the debt load issue, because I think so much of, as we look nationally at systems and institutions that are experiencing the worst projected losses by management, which, by the way, they're always projected losses, but they're not based on actually externally audited financial reports, CAFRs. And so I'm always skeptical about projections. I noticed, like with APSCUF, that the claim now is that you're going to save with this redesign $18 million in 5 years. That's like couch change for the kinds of restructuring and upheaval you're bringing to communities and people's lives. So I'm gonna offer a few national thoughts. As many of you may know, I study this stuff, but now I'm going to filter them through a local that just started up at the University of Arizona during the pandemic in response to a lot of the issues that my fellow panelists have talked about. United Campus Workers Arizona, which is an affiliate of CWA. And I think there's a couple of interesting things about what's happening nationally and what's happening locally. One is the creativity of the coalitions. So we haven't talked up to this point as much about staff, although there's reference to working on their behalf. But the interesting thing about these United Campus Worker Unions is that they combine faculty, tenure stream, as well as contingent, staff at all levels, student workers at all levels. And so kind of the scope of bargaining issue that Becky raised also is about what's the scope of the way you think about who's in your coalition on campus, but also off campus in terms of being in community with a range of labor groups and community groups and activist groups. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has helped contribute to, and each of you in different ways have spoken to it, is a fuller understanding of how we are in this together. And it's important that we think about our work in relation to each other, but also in relation to the communities that we should be serving. So I'm really just going to offer kind of 3 thoughts nationally and play those out in this local context in about 4 minutes. And then we'll have full half hour for questions. I see there's 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A, and so I encourage people to offer some questions. The first thought is, overwhelmingly, there was a piece within the last month that basically, in the Chronicle, that basically said, so what happened to doomsday? It didn't happen. So to my point about projected losses, these extreme projected catastrophic losses overwhelmingly have not happened. In some places, yes, they have, but mostly not. And so I just think the idea of undercover of COVID, undercover of this claimed disaster, what I've called disaster academic capitalism, you amplify restructuring efforts. APSCUF's been fighting that restructuring kind of plan for many years prior to COVID, and COVID is yet like another kind of reason or rationale for doing it. And I think we just need to be deeply, deeply skeptical of the mismanagerial choices that led us to these disastrous situations. And they often have to do, as you were saying, Justin, with this foolish overinvestment in facilities that are trying to attract not just out-of-state students, but frankly, whiter and wealthier students. And for any university or college that's problematic on multiple levels, for regional institutions, which are the ones that have been the hardest hit by the pandemic, it's just fundamentally not achievable. So you invest in these facilities, you build them, nobody comes, right? What happens is you increase your debt load, you shift that debt load, as you pointed out, Jamie, to the debt load of the students. So I think we need to be skeptical about this, once again, claim of disaster. The second thing that runs throughout, and we did this at our local, what triggered the rise of this local was a furloughs plan that was the first and worst in the country. We commissioned an analysis by Howard Buncis at Eastern Michigan of the AUP. He came in and said, you actually have $800 million in reserves. So we organized, we're not a collective bargaining unit, we're a minority union, but we succeeded over time in reshaping that furlough plan in some fundamental ways, creating a floor so that lower paid workers would not be furloughed at all, creating more of a progressive scale, and cutting the furloughs in half. The second issue is what Charles was foregrounding, and that's the racial reckoning that the country, some parts of the country or some people in the country are promoting and engaging in. Too many are not. And I think we need to be doing that more in the academy. And I know the CFA is a great example of a union that's been doing this for some time. But there's a counter narrative to this dominant narrative of crisis. And this narrative that, okay, maybe we can get back to normal. And that is that the normal was pretty awful. The normal was a normal of systemic inequities for students, for communities, and for employees that are unacceptable. And so I think it's just heartening to hear in each of your presentations how your creative ideas are based on a truly solidarity notion of we are in this together, and we're foregrounding the most vulnerable, the BIPOC populations, the workers, the students, the communities that were most hard hit, not just by the pandemic, but by systemic inequity. And what can we do moving forward? So that too has been at the center of this local that I'm in. What animated us probably even more than the budget stuff was the acquisition by the University of Arizona of a for-profit university, Ashford University, which targets and preys on lower income students, students of color, vets. And that really triggered and energized a lot of collaborative activity among staff, among students, and among faculty. And what we're in the process of doing now, and I'll just kind of close with this, is putting together, by way of creative ideas, something that each of you has sort of centered on, and that is the idea of a worker's budget. So if we were going to be creating what the budget should be like, where would we be moving over the next 5 to 10 years, the institution? Where would we be pushing for the resources to shift from central administration out to cultural centers, support units in cultural centers, where on my campus, that's where staff have disproportionately and grad students been laid off. You were sort of hinting at that, Charles, but it's clearly happened at my campus. So what are our goals? What are we fighting for, not just what we're fighting against? So I think we've had some great examples of reactive, mitigating excesses, and that's certainly happened in my local. But I'm most excited about these larger coalitions and ideas for what would a worker's budget look like. And part of that would be, to your point, Justin, about bond funding for facilities. One of the things that we've been pushing for is we're in a pandemic. The bond funding should be for people. It should be for students. It should be for staff. It should be for adjunct faculty who've gotten non-renewed. And the response is, oh no, the way the state statutes are written is you can only do bonds for facilities. Well, that plays into this capitalistic acquisition and accumulation process and indebtedness process that Justin, you talked about, but Jamie, your institution is deeply experiencing, as are others. So I just think those kind of creative ideas for, as we go forward, what could we be doing in concert with others is going to be a way that we get beyond the old normal, which was pretty awful, where we fight the claimed new normal yet again of financial crisis, which generally is not the case, and where instead we define a new progressive normal that comes democratically from the workers in the communities that are the most important parts of these institutions. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I hope we have, I know we have, I saw one question early on. Becky, it was for you. And I don't know if it's easier for the person to ask it or for me just to read it. It's from Matt, and he's asking about how in sort of working on behalf of the part-time lecturers, how did you ensure that you were, that they had a voice in what you were working for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it probably won't surprise you to know that we have a pretty strong commitment to people speaking for themselves and not speaking for others. So we, I would say, forced our part-time lecturers into the room. Sometimes they were able to actually be at our Zoom bargaining table with us. If they weren't, it was frequent check-ins. Sometimes we had folks in a breakout room while there was a main table going on. We didn't agree to anything that wasn't really explicitly discussed. And we had lots of obviously side meetings both. So what I would say is we had our broader coalition to which, everyone was a party. And then we had the formal bargaining table, which was those that were a party to this very specific negotiation. But the coalition is the coalition, and that means everyone speaks for themselves, and we try to protect the most vulnerable. So they were in every room. We were in our leadership's in frequent discussion with our part-time lecturer leadership, and there was no sense at which we would, do the prioritization or make decisions or, anything like that without knowing what our part-time lecturers and their membership really wanted and what was acceptable to them and what their bottom lines were. And that was shared not just by the full-time faculty and grads, but by staff as well. And I should say it was really heartening to see staff absolutely willing to go to the mat for part-time lecturers and for grad workers, right? We saw staff who in some cases had massive layoffs already in their units and pink slips were coming as we were at the bargaining table say, we're gonna wait, we're gonna hold out. Grads need extensions. We understand that that's a form of layoffs and we're gonna hold out and be with them. So everybody spoke for themselves, and whether they were at the formal bargaining table, the coalition was a place where everybody spoke for themselves.
Yeah, that's a great, nothing about us without us, right? And I think, the interesting thing also in this wall-to-wall unit that I'm a part of is, so we have a steering committee with equal representation of the different workers. And at our last meeting, staff came forward with some concerns about library restructuring to faculty. Faculty use film in their classes, it impacts curriculum, there's a restructuring that's taking place. And so they were wanting for us as a union to weigh in on this restructuring plan. And the challenge that the staff faces, they're at-will employees in Arizona, like truly at will. A couple of years ago, they were restructured as at-will employees. And so part of the nothing about us without us was, okay, let's meet with the staff caucus, have them identify what are sort of the talking points that people who have a little more job security can take forward publicly. So I think just that, as you say, it's messy, Becky, but it's really important to always have people in the room. Okay, I see in chat, workers budget. Any other questions? I think, in the Zoom world, I know it's hard for people to raise questions, so I don't actually see any additional questions. I'm just going to encourage people. A lot of nice comments in chat, 100%, right? But let's have some questions. And in the interim, if there's some things that panelists would like to speak to or ask each other, that would be great.
This is Charles. I just wanted to follow up on Rebecca's response in terms of contingent faculty in bargaining and et cetera. I know we are currently bargaining in CFA, and our bargaining team has a significant contingent of our lecturer faculty. But then that is part of all the work that we do. When you talk about anti-racism and social justice transformation, it means that the people that you bring to the table cannot be the same people. And in CFA, in terms of our structure, we have 3 councils. And we have a lecturers council, a chapter president's council, and a racial and social justice council. Each of those councils have 2 associate vice presidents. And so they're involved in everything that we do. And I think that is critical in terms of we're all in this together. We are all in it together, but all of these voices have to be participating too. And again, to just emphasize something that Rebecca said, when you really are trying to be a democratic organization, it is messy. It means that meetings are now longer because you want to make sure you have these additional voices. When you're doing work in sort of small groups, et cetera, you have to make sure that those small groups look like our organization and our students, et cetera. So it is a lot of work, but it's necessary if we're going to do transformation. And that's also something in terms of our discussion today. We must transform the academy. I know Gary mentioned we can't go back to the normal because the normal was ugly. So we have to think about these structural changes that we have to make. Certainly a lot of it is about money, but a lot of it is also changing the attitudes of some of our colleagues and how they look at our faculty and students of color. That's also important as well.
So we do now have a second question by Alyssa. I guess maybe it's easier for me to read it, but Kazim, I don't know if you can give Alyssa's mic, open it up so that they can ask the question. If I don't hear from you, I'll just start reading it. Thanks for the attention to the specter of disaster as a rationale for harsh measures. Could any of the panelists like to speak to the question of management driving campus decisions by their projections? I'll emphasize again, projections. Usually the projections are really ill-conceived. And I'll just note that I noticed that there's a state senator now in Pennsylvania who is calling for a pause on that redesign plan because there are inadequate projections of what's the economic impact on the local communities. But anyway, I'll keep reading. By their projections of the labor market. That is, only putting resources towards programs that they perceive as attracting enrollments at the expense of other programs. There's a general worry that many of our institutions are no longer comprehensive, but labor market driven. I don't know if any of I'll just briefly say, the record of management in succeeding in attracting and predicting enrollments and building facilities and have people come to them is pretty abysmal. So even to the point of, did you do a market survey? Do you have any data that would suggest that people are going to come? Almost never do you see that with the management plan. So I think just like with finances, it's possible for coalitions of groups on and off campus to challenge the viability and really the thoughtfulness of what kind of preparation was done in doing these projections. But Justin, Charles, Becky, Jamie, do you want to speak to that question? Jamie does.
I do. Thank you. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to actually respond a little bit. I can talk about my home university in terms of answering the first part, potentially. My home university is Indiana University of Pennsylvania. We're always named after other states. We have California University of Pennsylvania too, Charles. So, but at IUP, and this is when I've been there for 25 years. One of our former presidents decided that we needed to do a residential hall revival, spending $250 million on the residence halls to do exactly what you were talking about, Gary. Let's try to attract maybe wealthier students in because we have to have all of these amenities. Then also in the infinite wisdom decided we also needed a convention center. And that was another $50 million in investment. And much like Justin is talking about, then all of a sudden you have all of this bond debt, you have all of these payments that you have to make. And they did this at about the time our enrollments were hitting their peak. So as enrollments began to decline, which we could have projected, there were fewer and fewer students who wanted to live in those residence halls. So we now have a lot of that sitting empty. If you fast forward a few more years, we had a president who decided we needed to get away from flat tuition. So students paying, one rate, whether they took 12 credits or 18, to a per credit tuition model, which drove up the price of tuition about 20 to 25%.
Mhm.
And not surprisingly, now we've seen steeper declines. And then the next step will be retrenchments for faculty and staff furloughs. And that's exactly what happened with at my home university, the issuance of 82 letters in October. And so there's, clearly that piece. And then with projections for budgets, you mentioned Howard Bunces. He always says budgets begin with B and end with S. Right?
Yes, he does.
And that's exactly what we've seen.
Yeah.
And so we've seen these projections, and one of the things we've often said is if you want to make your budget look bad because you want to advocate for more funding, we'll help you with that. But when you're making your budget look bad so that you can furlough and do layoffs, that's where it starts to cross into that dark place. And one of the things, and this will be the last thing I mentioned, that I'm concerned about, and not just me, others in our unions, is that we're coming up to the end of the fiscal year.
Mhm.
A lot of the COVID funding will not arrive until after the next fiscal year. And if we're going to use projections based on where we are at the end of the 2020-21 fiscal year, to be planning for what does our budget look like going into the fall,
Mhm.
they could make it look disastrous and dismal, and that could lead to just exactly what we're facing now with furlough notices and retrenchments going out. And by the time you can actually dig into those budgets and figure out this was BS, you're so far down the track of people beginning to think about losing their jobs that it's hard to hit the brakes and backtrack. So I'll stop there, but yeah, absolutely, we have experienced that and have concerns moving forward about these projections.
Right. We've got it.
Can I just add to?
Oh, go ahead, Charles. Sorry.
At the beginning of the pandemic, we started getting all of this disaster budget nonsense from the administration. They were talking about on the campus levels that many of the 10% reduction and all this that student enrollment was going to go down. None of that happened. Student enrollment actually stayed the same, and on many campuses increased. And in terms of budget, we just got the governor Newsom just did his May revise last Friday. It's a huge surplus. We know we have gotten funding back into the CSU. So my thought is that most of the time administrators are not telling the truth. And beyond that, you need to have folks like Howard Bunson who can come to your campuses and talk and help you find all these reserves that they have as well. We also had a state audit that showed the tremendous surplus the CSU has in its reserve funds that can be used for rainy days. So we have to actually have the rainy day yet. They're always crying rainy day. But anyway, they don't tell the truth, and you have to go beyond what they say.
Right. Like, I think it's raining. It's a once in 100-year pandemic. So we got another couple questions. I want to make sure we're able to get to them. Laura, great to hear from you. So Laura Murphy asks, thanks for the wonderful panel. On a unionized campus, do panelists think it is helpful to the union if there is a standing budget committee as part of the shared governance structure? And
I'll
Laura,
jump in.
just for Justin's benefit, I don't know if you know Laura, but she's at a community college. So I don't know that necessarily matters, but it's worth noting. Go ahead, Becky, sorry.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I'll say that I think all of these governance structures are useful. They're never enough, but anything that gives you access to information, the ability to demand information, the ability to get credibility from the administration and potentially from faculty and staff who might have particular opinions of the union can be helpful. So it's not enough, but it's better than not having it. I think having access to this information, if you're at a public institution, we sort of cobble together our budget information from stuff that that management agrees we have a right to, from stuff we access via shared governance committees, and then stuff we put in through Freedom of Information Act requests. And we have a multi-pronged approach, and I think you have to get your information and your voice through multiple channels. So having it is better than not having it, but it's an organizing tool. It's not a solution.
We got two other questions, and I'll just let panelists know if you want to respond to some of these questions in typing, type them in as they're specified, that would be great. First one is from Brett Benjamin. Are there any instructive examples of actually reversing the reliance on contingent faculty, returning to an educational model where tenure track faculty are in the large majority? And then as you think about that, I'll give Justin some time to think about a response to Len Paillo. Justin referenced the new administration's Department of Education, improved relationship. How can we leverage their help with public higher education institutions in our states? For example, with executive orders or proposals that will complement what's happening at the federal level. So the first is any instructive examples of actually reversing the balance between contingent and tenure stream faculty. And the second one, how to leverage this new situation, not just sit back and say, oh, great, we got a more supportive administration. Like what can the folks at the state and local level actually do?
In terms of, I'll just give a brief answer. In terms of contingent faculty or adjunct faculty, we do have in our collective bargaining agreement, they're part of our union. We have in our CBA a limit of 25%, so no more than 25% of the faculty can be contingent, but we also have a mechanism in place where they can be converted to be placed on the tenure track. And so if they've been teaching at a given university for the equivalent of 4 years, they can begin to transition with the vote of the faculty in their department into a tenure track, and management has very little they can do to stop that. They try, but there's little that they can do to deny that movement. So those are the kinds of things we've been trying to work on in APSCUF, and that dates back to probably the origin of our union.
Yeah, you've got fabulous language on that. And there's this is a great panel for asking that question, because the CFA is often seen as a model contract for contingent faculty, and part-time lecturers are such a strong group at Rutgers. So Charles or Becky, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
Well, in our current bargaining, we are trying to do some of what Jamie just mentioned in terms of increasing the opportunities for our lecturer faculty to move to the tenure line. Also, we know that it is a concern of our state legislature. They know that tenure density in the CSU must be addressed. And then we also, in terms of the organizing piece, we make the argument to our tenure line faculty that converting and moving contingent faculty to tenure line is going to help them as well. There's a lot more to be done with it, particularly in our system when the majority of instructional faculty are contingent faculty.
Becky?
Yeah, I'll just add, a few things. There's, I guess, for us, two different kinds of contingent faculty. There's our adjuncts who are hired class to class, gig economy, piece rate workers, however you want to put it, are most insecure. We also have a large number of what at many places would be called lecturers, so full-time non-tenure track faculty. And we've been doing better and better with security for those full-time non-tenure track folks. They now have the right for 6-year contracts, and they have a promotion path. And we're still hoping to fight for teaching tenure, but we're short of tenure, but not at, we're short of teaching tenure, but at better security. So there's actually a renewal process. A non-renewal has to be justified, things like that. So there's better security, but it's not there. As far as more security for the adjuncts, for those real gig workers, I think there are some paths, but they're not clear. I think fractional appointments where they're at least paid the appropriate fraction of a full-timer's salary so that they're not a cheaper alternative. If you're using adjuncts, you're not doing it to save money. You may be doing it for other reasons. And so when adjuncts are doing that larger fraction of the work, they're entitled to benefits, or they're reclassified as half-timers or full-timers. I think that's something. And there's also some innovative pathways I put this in the chat, but in the Sanders Jayapal College for All, it's a little bit mentioned in the op-ed I shared, and you can look at the full set of proposals to see a situation that would require higher ed institutions getting federal support to move to 75% essentially non-contingent faculty, and a pathway for the people doing that adjunct work now to get into those positions. So there's some good thinking going on. I think that I would agree with where I think that questioner is coming from, in that there's a lot of work to be done. And we don't have tons of great examples. We have a few we can pick, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that proposal, Becky. Justin, do you want to speak to there's two questions now for you. The first one is about what to do to leverage at the state level. And the second one is about any kind of data that NEA is doing at the national level about debt load, the growth of capital investments and the growth of administrative positions.
Sure. So I'll tackle the first one from Len first. So the short answer, obviously, is engaging with your state affiliate of some kind right now. I'll get that out of the way. The second thing is that yes, the relationship is certainly going to be better. We have allies, in the White House, and the Dr. Jill Biden. All right, but that doesn't mean that things are going to be given to us, right? I'm an organizer by trade, and so now more than ever is the time where we have to push in a coordinated, comprehensive campaign nationally, which I feel is happening. There's a burgeoning movement happening on a number of different fronts to of course increase federal level funding to our public higher education with strings attached. But the reality is that we're going to have to campaign our asses off. That's what we're going to have to do. I wish that there was an easier answer to that. But comprehensive campaigning is the only solution in order to, get the federal government and state governments to do what they need to do. These are long-standing trends of disinvestment, of corporatization. None of that's going to change because we elected a Democrat. That's just the reality of it. Now, is this substantially better than working with the Betsy DeVos administration and the Trump administration? Absolutely, no question about it. But the reality here is that we're going to have to leverage our time more effectively, and also contribute outside of our research, outside of our staff work, really take on and embody the fact that every one of our members has a responsibility to students themselves and the institutions to really get out there and advocate and be activists. So that starts at the very basic of levels. But I will suggest, Len, that check out I think there was in there about the New Deal for higher education. That's a good place to start, I think, with a comprehensive, concentrated group of folks who are campaigning for change. Because the reality is that no one will do things for us unless we make them. So that's a really top grass tops type of answer, but I really also feel like it's probably.
No, I think that's really smart. I was in DC the month Obama was inaugurated, and I felt like some of the unions were a little too much. Oh, great, we have a Democrat in the White House. We can play the backroom game and we'll be fine. And I think what you're saying about organizing is exactly right. Since APSCUF and CFA and the Rutgers unit are so smart at their state level work, do you, any of you want to offer thoughts about how to leverage the federal administration at the state level? If not, that's fine.
I'll just say briefly, I mean, we're doing well with the state, but we also went through the Chris Christie administration. So it's not like, you know, that relationship is always working in your favor by any means. But to us, it's really about making sure that we work closely with the state to understand and to help them understand that when federal money comes in, that doesn't mean cut state money. And it also means making sure that our state electeds put pressure on Rutgers that federal money should be spent in appropriate ways. It should not go to, you know, shiny buildings. And we definitely agree with student support, which is where a lot of recent federal money has gone in the various relief and stimulus acts. But we want to work closely with the state to make sure that state appropriations are where they need to be, even when federal money goes up and when federal money goes down. So to kind of making sure that they're not seen as a substitute, they both need to grow massively.
And I would just add, I've said it before, but I just think we all need to get involved with the New Deal campaign for higher ed as a way to make those connections at the federal level and to organize around and to put pressure on.
And
I guess-
Justin, sorry, Jamie, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to follow up on what Becky just said. We have done a lot, but let me stop there. In APSCUF, we have a wonderful staff, and we have individuals who, you know, work exclusively on organizing, but our government relations director has done a phenomenal job in setting up meetings regularly with legislators so that we can get all of our issues out there and make sure they're aware of the kinds of things Becky is talking about. Don't cut our funding because we might have some COVID relief. But it's gotten, I think, you know, you mentioned the senator who's trying to pause the redesign. You know, we meet with those individuals on a regular basis to make sure they're aware. And it's gotten to a point where we've had some state legislators ask our chancellor, why aren't you asking for more money?
Good for you.
So, I mean, I think, you know, it does take a lot of work and a lot of smart people and people that are a lot smarter than me that have been working for APSCUF on those kinds of issues as well.
So I want to just, we're just about at our time. Justin, if you could, you know, link anything in the chat, that would be great. I just want to thank the panel. I think this was a great session. Thank Bill for putting this together in the center. Thank the audience for being here. I want to remind folks, there are some really good sessions tomorrow morning on the Biden administration, since we're talking about federal stuff, and about Catholic social teaching, as well as in the afternoon about some very specific things on grievances and collective bargaining. So thanks all for coming, especially to the panelists. This was a blast and very heartening.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Thanks for having me.